Well, welcome. So as people are coming in from the waiting room, I just want to welcome everybody to this African American Intellectual Thought Symposium, which it's really an honor to be helping to sponsor this and host it. Of course, this all is Dr. Malik Simba's brainchild, so I'm gonna give him the microphone in just a second, but I wanted to just say a couple words of thanks as we get started today. Um, and as you know, the focus of this event is the 1619 Project. As you know, interesting, controversial. I think we're gonna have a great conversation here. One of the principles of the Ethics Center is to try to have civil discourse and civil dialogue. So I want to encourage our participants out in the audience, when you do post a question to the chat, let's try to keep it civil, right? So it's okay if we disagree, but let's disagree in a reasonable way, okay? So as you all know, this is a webinar. I encourage the audience to use the chat function and the Q&A function in order to post questions. So a couple of quick words of thanks. The main sponsor of this is Fresno State's Africana Studies program. And so I'd just like to say a special thanks to Professor Thomas Ellis, who is the director of that program currently, and my colleague here in the College of Arts and Humanities. And then also, of course, Dr. Malik Simba, who is kind of been the force behind this for many years now. We'd also like to thank the Fresno College of Social Sciences, the Fresno State Alumni Association, which is helping to set up this Zoom room for us. Some of the funding is provided by Fresno State's Instructionally Related Activities Fund. And then I would like to especially thank my student assistant, Ebony Gonzalez Burgos, who has been doing great work on the technical side of events we've been doing this semester. So let me just do a quick introduction of Dr. Malik Simba and then let him say a few words. I've known Malik for many years now. He used to beat up on me on the basketball court years ago. Malik, you may remember that. And he is a professor emeritus from the Department of History and Africana Studies. And he has been organizing this and other events on campus for many, many years. And I respect his intellect and his experience and his passion for this sort of stuff. So Dr. Simba, would you like to say a few words as we get started?
Thank you, Dr. Fiala. This is, I think, approximately the 15th or the 16th year that we've done this symposium. The purpose is to share the intellectual ideas generated by historians, philosophers, and other social scientists about the history and culture of the Africana experience. Let me share with you some lists of the previous symposium. Our first symposium concerned the Herbert Aptheker and the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Aptheker from San Jose to participate in that first symposium. And he gave some very insightful, intimate information about Dr. Du Bois because they were basically office mates. And Du Bois, as most of you know, gave his papers to Dr. Aptheker, okay? And Herbert Aptheker, of course, is a Marxist historian who did the famous book on the history of Negro slavery routes, okay? So that was our first, and you know, when Herbert Aptheker spoke, all the students were crying because he had such intimate information on Dr. Du Bois. The second one was the rise and fall of modern Black leadership, okay? And the late Viscount Nelson from UCLA gave that presentation based upon his book, which is The Rise and Fall of Modern Black Leadership. The third symposium dealt with street scholars, and the late Ralph Crowder, whose book is on street scholars, Black intellectuals without portfolio, okay? And then the fifth symposium was Black philosophy and the race-class question. And Dr. McClendon, of course, was the central focus of that because he's the foremost expert on race-class from a Marxist perspective. And in fact, Dr. McClendon is the only intellectual who's been a member of each of the 16 symposiums. By request of many people to bring him back, okay. And then the 16th is We Come This Far by Faith, Liberation Theology, and the Destiny in the African-American Religious Experience. And that was also driven by Dr. McClendon, who has a particular book on a conversation with my Christian brothers, Black theology. Actually, the book I think titled is Black Christology, okay? And then the 7th one has to do with Dr. Ferguson's and Dr. McClendon's book, Beyond the White Shadow, Philosophy, Sport, and the African-American Experience. It's an interesting book because the information on sports history from the African experience from a materialist analysis is very interesting. That's Beyond the White Shadow. And most of you know that The White Shadow is a very popular TV program in the 1970s. The 8th symposium was Black Women, Literary Expression, Aesthetic Writings, Political Writings, and Autobiographical Writings. Black Women's Literary Expression, that's number 8. Number 9 was Black Lives Matter, Willie Horton and the American Dilemma. The 10th symposium was Study and Struggle in Africana Studies. And that was important because Dr. Ferguson, who has subsequently published his book on Nothing Left of Blackness, which is a Marxist understanding of Black studies and the intellectual travails of Black studies. Then we had the 11th, I'm going to skip a couple. The 11th was the 2016 presidential election. The subtitle of that, Make America White Again. The 12th was really interesting because it was American business and diversity. And we had a dynamic duo, Dr. McClendon and his son, Roger McClendon, who's a power player in the corporate world today. So that was American Business and Diversity. The 13th was on Dr. McClendon's book, Black Christology and the Quest for Authenticity, a philosophical appraisal. Last year, we had the symposium on the coronavirus and the virus of racism. And we had a medical doctor from Seattle. I can't recall his name at the moment, but he gave the medical history of virus health and the Black community. And Dr. McClendon was there, and I think we had one other. And so those are, in a snippet, some of the topics of the past symposium. I have created this symposium and some other activities within the Africana Studies program. This particular one was generated by my reading of 2 basic books when I was in graduate school at the famous, in some circles, the infamous University of Minnesota, by people in Michigan. Okay, so the first book, of course, is Black Nationalism in America by John Bracey and Elliot Ruckwick and August Meyer. That book is the intellectual history of Black nationalism and how people who were trying to understand the trajectory of African American history began to look at the intellectual thoughts either from a perspective of integrationism or immigration or separatism. So Black nationalism in America is really a great edited book of many of the great writers in African intellectual thought debating is the thrust of intellectual argument and debate, segregation or integration, separatism and integration. The other book that I came across when I was in grad school was a book that people really are not familiar with. It's Howard Brott's, B-R-O-T-Z. It's the history of Negro thought in America. And one thing about the Brott's book that fascinated me when I was in grad school is that it dealt with people that develop intellectual ideas within the African experience that you really never hear about. People know about Du Bois and Garvey, but Brott's book is an edited book dealing with people like T. Thomas Fortune, Martin Delany, Edward Blyden, James Holly, Henry Highland Garnett, Alexander Gromel, and many, many others. So the Howard Brott's book, As with Black Nationalism in America, is really the intellectual antecedents for me to begin this symposium of the African Intellectual Thought Symposium. One other point, this is a precursor to our other major activity for Africana Studies, which is the Martin Luther King Gunnar Myrdal Lecture, which we try to do every year. This year, it will be on May 20th, which is a Wednesday. And the speaker will be Dr. Quintor Taylor. He is the founder of the website www.blackpast.org. Now that website is so important, we get, because I'm on the advisory board, as with Dr. McClendon, it gets 7 million visitors a year. 1 million every February. I was at a conference in Vegas and I saw that there was a teachers conference in Vegas at the same hotel. And I came up to 2 young Black teachers and I gave them my card, which is the blackpast.org card, business card. And they said, oh, no, we know about that. It's required in our secondary school to use BlackPass as a research engine. They were from some town in Florida I never heard of. That's how big blackpast.org, 7 million visitors per year, 1 million in February. So the topic of Dr. Quintor Taylor lecture, MLK Myrdal lecture on May 20th, Wednesday, is Searching for Critical Race Theory and the 1619 Project in the Digital Age via www.blackpast.org. Okay, so set your calendar for May 20th. And with that, that's my introduction. Dr. Fiala and my colleagues, you can go at it.
Dr. Simba, thank you so much, and thank you for your wisdom and leadership on this over the years. I mean, this is an important event that you take charge of, and again, thank you for your leadership and friendship. So it's my honor now to introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to present. It also turns out that it's alphabetical, which helps me keep my thinking organized about this. So first off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen C. Ferguson, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at North Carolina State University. His areas of specialization are African American philosophy, political philosophy, Marxism, philosophy of social science, and philosophy of sports. He's the author of African American Philosophers and Philosophy, an introduction to the history, concepts, and contemporary issues, which he co-authored with one of our other panelists, Dr. McClendon. He is also the author of Philosophy of African American Studies, Nothing Left to Blackness. And he is the co-author with John McClendon again of that book mentioned earlier, Beyond the White Shadow, Philosophy, Sports, and the African American Experience. So Steve, it's good to see you again. Let me
Thank you for having me.
introduce, yeah, I'm so glad you're here. So let me introduce next Dr. Nigel Hatton, who is Associate Professor of Literature and Philosophy and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Merced, the University of California, Merced, up the road from us here in the Central Valley. He's a founding member of the UC Critical Refugee Studies Collective and adjunct faculty with the Narrative Medicine program at Columbia University. He's also part of the faculty committee for the Mount Tamalpais College at San Quentin State Prison. He's written articles on human rights and literature and on thinkers such as Soren Kierkegaard, Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, Roberto Fernandez Retamar, and Ivan Klima. He's published in the James Baldwin Review, Peace Review, a journal of social justice, Kierkegaard Research, and other journals and book collections. Dr. Hatton, it's very nice to make your acquaintance. I'm so glad you could join us. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. John H. McClendon, who is professor in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. His publications include African American Philosophers and Philosophy, an introduction to the history, concepts, and contemporary issues, which he co-authored with Dr. Ferguson. He wrote a book, Black Christology and the Quest for Authenticity, a Philosophical Appraisal, which I had the good fortune to read and comment on, and I enjoyed that quite a bit. Again, made a lasting impact on me. He has also authored Philosophy of Religion and African American Experience, Conversations with My Christian Friends. That book, again, Beyond the White Shadow. And he has also published C.L.R. James Notes on Dialectics, Left Hegelianism or Marxism-Leninism. Dr. McClendon is very active as a member of the American Philosophical Association and was formerly co-editor of the APA's newsletter on the philosophy of the Black experience. He's presently co-editor of the African American Philosophy series for Brill Publications. Dr. McClendon, welcome back to Fresno State.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
So the order of presentation will be Dr. Ferguson, followed by Dr. Hatton, and then Dr. McClendon. Dr. Ferguson, the floor is yours. Welcome.
All right, well, thank you so much, Andrew, for the warm welcome. And once again, I'd like to thank Malik, Simba. It's always a pleasure to come to Fresno, even if it's by way of video. What you've done with this series, this symposium, really embodies what Black African-American studies sets out to be. So I sincerely appreciate all the hard work that you've put in over the years and to let me be a part of that. So my paper is titled Black History Gentrified, and I'm using gentrified in a particular way, which I hope I'll be able to kind of elaborate on. And the subtitle is, as the symposium is, History, Philosophy, and the 1619 Project. I want to begin by kind of laying out some kind of preliminary suggestions about how we should frame the 1619 Project, because I think it's important in terms of evaluating the overall argument. If we think about it, I think it's important for us to understand that the Black liberation struggle is a social movement. And as such, its social content has continually changed over time. And when we think about that, that means that there have been various stages of struggle, various modes of struggle, and all of those have reflected specific and concrete social historical objectives. So for example, if we went back and we looked at the struggle to end slavery, what we would find is that the struggle took many different forms: slave revolts, Underground Railroad, work slowdowns, and the abolitionist movement. Each of these forms ended with the eradication of slavery. Once slavery ended, the social content of the Black liberation movement changed. The movement didn't end, but its content changed. So in this respect, I think it's important that we think of the Black liberation movement as an intergenerational relay race. And as such, it becomes the kind of obligation, duty, responsibility of each generation to pick up the baton and advance the struggle. A central component of the Black liberation struggle are ideological struggles. And these, in effect, are struggles at the level of ideas, particularly around questions about the strategies and tactics that will advance the overall movement. Today, I think one of the fundamental questions confronting our generation is the following. Are you for capitalism or socialism, reform or revolution, the bourgeoisie or the working class, bourgeois democracy or socialist democracy? And so with that, I think I at least give a nod that my approach to looking at the 1619 project is from the left. It's a Marxist perspective. I think when we conceptualize those questions and think about them, part of what we have to understand is that we're in a process of building a movement for liberation. But at this stage, we need to build a movement of liberation that is led by the working class. And it is inevitable that we will have to engage in ideological struggles around various issues that emerge. And the 1619 project kind of embodies that in many ways about where we stand in this particular moment as we begin to build a movement. Working class people face a great many problems in their everyday struggle to survive here and throughout the world. Given the fact that the vast majority of Black people in the United States are working class people, I think it's important that the Black liberation struggle develop a necessary connection with the struggle of working class people in the United States and throughout the world. Therefore, any ideology which seeks to speak to the Black working class and their day-to-day problems must be assessed by whether or not it advances their class interests as members of the working class. So when we look at the 1619 project, I think one of the central things that creates a kind of dilemma, if you will, in terms of how you go about critiquing it, is the fact that in effect, what we have is an edited anthology and with several contributors and poems throughout. As such, we might want to ask the question, to what extent does the editor take responsibility for each of the contributions that have been given? And when we look at the 1619 project, part of what Hannah Jones has provided us with when we look at several pieces that she has authored, she kind of provides us with organizing principles, if you will, on how we can understand the kind of larger project here. Clearly, if we look at the preface, which is subtitled The Origins, the first chapter, Democracy, and the concluding chapter, Justice, what Hannah Jones attempts to do is to give us some coherence about how all of these contributions from various scholars fit together to make a larger argument. But in effect, if we just look at many of Hannah Jones's public appearances, and if we look at the book, one of the ways in which she describes kind of what she's attempting to do is in commemoration of the 400th anniversary. And she says this over and over again, of the beginning of American slavery. The 1619 project, quote, aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. Now, it's kind of interesting, if you read the intro or the preface, she makes various references to Lerone Bennett as being a kind of spark in terms of the development of our own kind of national consciousness about the year 1619. But one way in which she differs from Lerone Bennett is that Lerone Bennett doesn't treat 1619 as the beginning of slavery, and most scholars within African-American studies don't treat the beginning of slavery in 1619 in this country. Lerone Bennett does a phenomenal job in the shaping of Black America of the role that indentured servitude played. And he also argues that the initial Africans that came here in 1619 were either indentured servants or free. And so that provides a kind of interesting counter narrative to the overall intention that Hannah Jones has in terms of the 1619 project. But I think if we kind of broaden the scope here, what we can see is that Black studies historically has always attempted to place the African-American experience in the context of the American experience. And so one way I think philosophically you can think about this is that while African-Americans have been in the United States, historically, they have not been of the United States. And that kind of, it resonates when you think of Malcolm X, who often talks about African-Americans being victims of Americanism. But if we look at the wider context here, I think why this book is important, there's several questions philosophically we could raise. What is the meaning of Black history? What strategies should Black people employ to achieve freedom? How should we characterize race relations in the United States? What is the role of interpretation in history writing? What role do class and class struggle play in history in general and United States history in particular? And what is the meaning of democracy for African-American people? I want to say just for a few minutes why I think this particular book has become important at this particular stage. And part of it has to do with a kind of sea change that has happened in Black politics over the last 50 years. As the country has moved more to the right in the last 50 years, beginning with the election of Ronald Reagan, we could push it back some and talk about the role that Jimmy Carter played in that transition. But in general, what we've seen is a kind of shift politically in terms of political ideology to the right in a lot of ways, such that in many ways, when we look at contemporary thought, liberalism is positioned itself as a radical alternative, given the kind of rightward stance in the country overall. Clearly, if we look at ruling class ideology, one could make the argument that the ruling class ideology is fractured or split, if you will, into two camps. One is clearly the conservative camp, which in many ways, going back to Ronald Reagan, kind of represents this view that best captured by his famous statement that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And so in many ways, the Republican Party represents that kind of long trend of conservatism, which has kind of gutted all the advancements that were made with New Deal liberalism. But on the other hand, when we look at ruling class ideology, particularly in its liberal form, what we see emerging is a form of liberalism that does not support the working class in terms of the legislation that it passes, but is more committed to corporate multiculturalism. And so what we can see is that when we look at the wide perspective here, Hannah Jones really comes out of this larger tradition, this new tradition, if you will, of liberalism that positions itself as radical, but engages in a number of problematic presuppositions, if you will, in terms of advancing her overall liberalism. One way in which you could think about this is that if you were to look at liberal perspectives on Black liberation, I think there's a number of components in terms of the contemporary framework that we should kind of keep in the back of our minds. One is that most Black liberals are committed to some form of liberal equality of opportunity as the baseline principle for social justice. Secondly, there's a tendency to formulate racial inequality as a problem rooted in whiteness, white privilege, or white supremacy. Third, there's this constant usage that we've seen, for example, with the recent book, Caste, to use racial caste as a framework to discuss contemporary race relations. Next, there's a tendency also to disconnect the roots of racial inequality from the political economy of capitalism. And then lastly, there's a tendency to appeal to either Black capitalism or reparations as the solution to racial inequality. And I think all of that is embodied in when we look at Hannah Jones' overall perspective. One thing I would say before I examine particular points that she makes in the book is that fundamentally what her supporters and herself don't recognize is that racial analysis without any critique of capitalism is merely superficial description. And that's very important to understand. The second point that I think I want to make here is that if we look at the formation of the United States, one of the central points that we have to come to terms with is that the United States was a country that was built on the foundation of a multi-ethnic, a multiracial working class. And so while it is true that African Americans played a similar role in terms of the development of the United States as a home market, we should not ignore the role that Euro-Americans, that Asian Americans, Latino Americans have also played in terms of the development of this country, particularly in terms of working class people. I think that's central to understand. But when we begin to look at the content of what Hannah Jones argues, what I've tried to do is to kind of pull out 6 statements that I think are seminal to kind of capture the overall argument that she wants to make. And I'll briefly read these out. One of the interesting things about tackling this book is that as Hannah Jones received criticisms before the publication of the book, she tried to adjust some of these statements. So there's a somewhat of a difference between the original 1619 project that was published on the website and the actual book. But in general, I think this captures her central argument, if you will. And I think each of these points, I think there's a level of contention we could raise about each of these points. So she begins by arguing, in effect, that every country develops their own origin stories. And she argues that these origin stories function as myths designed to create a shared sense of history and purpose. So in effect, she doesn't believe that there is an objective character to history. Secondly, she argues a truer origin story, and I think she's using truer here in a relativist sense, requires us to place Black Americans prominently in the role of democracy's defenders and perfecters. I'm sure Malcolm X, Robert Williams, the early Robert Williams, will have a lot to say about the validity of those claims. Third, she argues what steals opportunities from Black Americans is the lack of wealth that has been a defining feature of Black life since the end of slavery. Next, she argues wealth, not simply securing rights, is the means to security in America. And she goes on to elaborate what she means by wealth. Next, she argues while unchecked discrimination still plays a significant role in circumscribing opportunities for Black Americans, it is white Americans' century-long economic head start that most effectively maintains racial caste today. And you'll notice that she uses the language of racial caste there. And I would love to have a more sustained discussion about that if we have time. Not even high earnings inoculate Black people against racialized disadvantage. So she wants to argue, the way I'm interpreting this is that even if you have a high earning or you're a high income African-American, that doesn't protect you against racialized disadvantage, which is definitely another point of contention we could raise. Next, she makes this kind of interesting claim, and this is found on the website. She slightly changes it in the book. Anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country. I think if we looked at these premises, one of the conclusions she reaches actually is that the only manner to create a just society in the United States is to morally persuade the federal government and or white people to give restitution or reparation to the descendants of slaves. Now, what I find interesting with this argument is that one of her central claims is that African Americans basically need to attain wealth in order to attain freedom or to live in a just society. What's problematic here, and this is kind of basic economics, is that she has no conception of how wealth is created in this country or throughout the world. wealth is created by the exploitation of labor power. There's no other way that we can conceptualize that. And so to not take that seriously into account, one could infer that what she wants is for either all African Americans to become capitalists, or for African Americans to have a class structure that resembles the white class structure, and so that we could have two racial caste systems, such that, as Booker T. Washington argued, we can be as separate as the fingers, but united as one. And that raises some very interesting questions, because she never comes to terms with how wealth is created. And even if you take many of her statements as metaphorical statements, she really doesn't understand the nature of a class structure, because we don't live post 1965 in a United States in which all white people are on top and all Black people are on bottom. It's just not the world that we live in today. And if you take that into account, what you have to see is that basically, and this is all inferred, and part of the inference results from the ambiguity of her argument. Basically, what she wants to create is a Black gentry class in order to argue that in some ways there's justice in this country. I think fundamentally, many historians have pointed out some of the historical accuracies, and I won't go into that debate because I'm not a historian, but I do think conceptually there are many problems that we have to take into account, not only when we run to defend her liberalism against the conservative attack, but we also have to engage in a leftist critique to point out the limitations of her framework. And if I were to look at the wider discussion out here today around the 1619 project, similar to when Clarence Thomas was confirmed as a Supreme Court justice, people are rushing to defend her because she's a Black woman, but not necessarily engaging in a substantive critique of what she's arguing within the 1619 project. I think the vast majority of people who are grounded in African-American studies welcome the kind of debate that has emerged. However, we haven't seen much of a left critique of the 1619 project. And it's kind of interesting. I saw a MSNBC clip where Clarence Page from the Washington Post, Eddie Glaude from Princeton, and Eugene Robinson kind of engaged in a soft debate with her. But it was a debate between conservatives and liberals. The left was completely absent from the whole debate about the 1619 project. And so I think it's seminal that if we're going to, celebrate this book, that we at the same time engage in a critical analysis that recognizes the chief limitation of her work is that she engages in a race analysis separated from a critique of capitalism and its material conditions. And she leaves us with a superficial description. In fact, you could argue it's more a journalistic description of African-American history. And in many instances, she distorts the nature of that history. And I think that's, in substance, what I would argue about the 1619 project.
Dr. Ferguson, thank you very much. Resting your case there, I think.
Yes, I will raise my case.
Okay. I mean, you raised a couple of really important points already. So thank you very much. So now I'd like to invite our colleague from UC Merced to the floor, Dr. Hatton. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Fiala, and thank you, Dr. Simba, for the opportunity to be a part of this very, very important symposium, and to be in the space of Fresno State. So I hope I can, be there physically one day and engage with you all. And thank you to Dr. Ferguson and Dr. McClendon for this opportunity to be on the panel with you. Right, and Dr. Ferguson has already started the fire, so we, I think, let me just jump on in here. I think, but I'd like to begin my comments by talking about a place I found myself recently, and if those in the audience or among the panel wish to name the place as I speak, please feel free to do so. There was a band jamming songs from the 70s and 80s. When I walked in, the band was moving through a raucous rendition of Joy and Pain by Mays, featuring Frankie Beverly, part of that permanent catalog of African-American life. The mostly African-American crowd enjoyed the music, the older ones in the crowd explaining the significance of Mays to the younger. There will be sorrow, but you will endure. Where there's a flower, there's the sun and the rain. Oh, and it's wonderful, they're both one and the same. Joy and pain are like sunshine and rain. Joy and pain are like sunshine and rain. Not far from the band, a group of young brothers played basketball and others sat around on benches. In the same place, I would hear someone, visible only by the moonlight, practicing Coltrane on a saxophone. On yet another occasion, a group of young rappers from across California, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego, shared and passed the mic while spitting their rhymes. African Americans were everywhere, and in the midst of everything, buses arrived to drop off even more African Americans. The place I am describing, the place where African American culture, songs, expression, life, interpersonal exchange are taking place, where I'm hearing the songs familiar to me from my youth. The place is San Quentin State Prison. The band, the saxophonist, the basketball players, the hip hop artists, the men moving about, the crowd, the men stepping off the green bus that just arrived, are all incarcerated human beings, predominantly African American, locked away along with their culture in a prison that some will leave, others might not. I begin this way to express a point of entry into history, philosophy, and the 1619 Project. We must link its historical summation and argumentative aim with the despair and violence and caging and inequities that face African Americans in the present. In the many panels surrounding the 1619 Project, the gathering of historians to contend and expand upon the important points of history, to talk about what the project got wrong or what it needed to clarify, particularly as it related to the American Revolution, and expanding on the complicated history and historiography of slavery. The esteemed historian Gerald Horne made it a point to commend Nikole Hannah-Jones on how she connected the stories and findings of the past to the present, the contemporary moment. That is, it is certainly important to deliver over historical accuracy, but we must also understand the importance of linking that historical record to its ramifications for human beings being affected by the legacies of slavery, the continuum of violence, and what I understand to be the state, systemic, social, intellectual, and spiritual control of Black life. As Dr. Horne points out, the problems of today have causes, roots. The 1619 Project unpacks those causes, those roots, and brings them to their 21st century formations. Nikole Hannah-Jones draws from many sources directly and indirectly to shape the 1619 Project, and certainly this includes both the direct and also the echoes of Ida B. Wells and W.E. Du Bois. I want to point to the presence of the souls of Black folk in the 1619 Project. Indeed, she does cite it, but more than cite it, you can hear the traces and echoes of it in the very writing of Hannah-Jones and others within the project, both the sociologists, journalists, indeed, because of Du Bois's impact across the intellectual tradition and its different ways in which we think about the academy. We see and hear his presence everywhere. And I do so because of Du Bois's articulation of interior life. And I want to think about interior life as another way for us to turn to this within this discussion of the 1619 Project. of the interior life of African Americans as they respond to slavery, right, Reconstruction, Jim Crow. That is, in the Souls of Black Folk, a genreless text, or a text with many genres. It is mining that space and dialectic between life lived and life living. If in my first point, I've asked us to reflect on the 1619 project and its linking of the past and the present, a second point would be to pressure the 1609 project's opening space for us to think about the incarceration and sublimation of a Black interior life. It opens this space inadvertently, that is, because it has the echoes of the souls of Black folk and the echoes of these traditions, right? There are ways in which we can turn to what is the philosophical if we want to bring them out and put them into more relief. As right, Ellison tells us of Invisible Man, he says, my narrator, like Dostoevsky's, is a thinker. My protagonist does possess a conscious philosophical dimensions. He lives by ideas. And so in reading the text and noting, right, the ways in which it culls and intersects and speaks to texts such as Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, I find that space for us to turn to the ways of thinking of interior life. So in that, when this begins and Hannah Jones writes that opening essay, she offers us claims such as the following. And in here, I'll quote from her. Without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different. It might not be a democracy at all. Further, she says, today's avant-garde nature of Black hairstyles and fashion displays, a vibrant reflection of enslaved people's determination to feel fully human through self-expression. The improvisational quality of Black art and music comes from a culture that, because of constant disruption, could not cling to convention. Black naming practices, so often impugned by mainstream society, are themselves an act of resistance. And then ultimate, right, also, as we can see clearly where she's drawing from the tradition, and we can hear the echoes of the souls of Black folk. Hannah Jones writes, the sorrow songs we sang in the fields to soothe our physical pain and find hope in a freedom we did not expect to know until we died became American gospel. Now, as I have tried to note in my opening, these acts of resistance, these cultural formations, historically in the contemporary moment, are under duress. Mays and Frankie Beverly, Coltrane, hip hop, locked up. Hannah Jones is making a point that we find throughout Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. And here, keeping in mind, I want to point to those resonances with what Hannah Jones is doing and what Du Bois is doing in his text. We, the darker ones, come even now not altogether empty-handed. There are today no truer exponents of the pure human spirit of the Declaration of Independence than the American Negroes. There's no true American music but the wild, sweet melodies of the Negro slave. The American fairy tales and folklore are Indian and African, and all in all, we Black men seem the sole oasis of simple faith and reverence in a dusty desert of dollars and smartness. Like Du Bois, Hannah Jones sees African Americans as true conveyors of democracy. Quote, the pure human spirit of the Declaration of Independence than the American Negroes, in Du Bois's words, and in Hannah Jones's words, quote, without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different. So, right, very much a very similar claim. And like Du Bois, Hannah Jones is citing the vibrancy and resistance of African-American cultural production. So thinking about the music, thinking about style, thinking about naming, right? When we read The Souls of Black Folk, we hear Du Bois making a similar move. And then certainly, like Du Bois, Hannah Jones evokes the power and possibility, still open and unanswered, of the sorrow songs. So I want to suggest that, right, even if it isn't a project that fully fleshes out its philosophical dimensions, it's those echoes of the text that it is borrowing from that give us that space to enter into it. And it would have been quite wonderful if these opportunities for pursuing that kind of entry would have been grasped even further. But it certainly keeps us understanding why we must, in mining that past, still connect it to that present. And here, you know, Arnold Ramper said when we were celebrating, you know, the publication of Souls and the 100-year anniversary, and he said, you know, as many are seeing as one of the most important texts written by an African American, Arnold Ramper says that most likely Souls will lose its priority of place only when a new America exists, free of the terrible legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. And then until then, it is an indispensable source of knowledge and inspiration. So I want to, for us to think about the ways in which those kinds of texts that are cited directly, but also indirectly within this project, that open the space for, right, both thinking about that historical and contemporary linking, but then also, as I've been suggesting, to think about what it means for how the project is asking us to understand what has happened and what is happening to Black interior life. It's interestingly, when we read the, you know, to read the contemporary reviews of the Souls of Black Folk, right, in 1903, the criticism, the resistance coming from white reviewers in the South, right, it's the same kind of criticism that the 1619 Project is receiving now. And so I want us to kind of think about the ways in which that text, as well as others, kind of open up the project more and you know, create what are kind of the missing gaps. And so that if historians are trying to argue for that kind of historical accuracy, right, that perhaps there's also a way in which one can argue for the kind of philosophical accuracy, or ways in which the interior life is something that can be further unpacked within this project. So the questions I'm attempting to pressure here: what happens if we consider the 69 Project in the context of the Souls of Black Folk? What happens when we think about the project in light of the social inequities facing African Americans in the present? Another, you know, the sociologist Matthew Desmond, the essay in the 1619 Project, makes the point that I think if you want to understand the brutality of American capitalism, you have to start on the plantation. And Hannah Jones equally is also pointing out that, right, in one other point in the project is that coming to terms with the fact that Black people were enslaved here longer than we have been free, right? And so she's making these. And these claims, and when these claims come about, it is the way in which that the project returns me back to that carceral space. The 69 Project does not offer new facts or ideas to the informed reader. In many ways, it represents a history lesson that perhaps public school systems have refused to include in their curriculum. Its power is not in its revelation, that indeed to read it is to say, okay, that's interesting. Okay, great. I certainly know some sources we could turn to know more about that. But a good and certainly quite wonderful way to, you know, open the newspaper or to see a book on the in the New York Times that is giving a summation of information that, you know, you would want the public to know. And so in that way, it is quite a remarkable project. But the power occurs when we weave it into the reality of African American life. It appears in a publication, the New York Times, that we understand as a newspaper of record, and that in its reporting every day is noting those health inequities, those social inequities, the political inequities, the kinds of violence that African Americans face. And so it appears in a newspaper of record that is reporting the very legacies of violence that are part of those roots that that Gerald Horne points to, that the 1619 Project is giving us the kind of the basis for. So the newspaper itself and what it reports alongside the very project is the material that we can draw from that very much is making this link between the past and present. And then, as I have noted, it is also giving us this sense of the interior life. And I'd really hopeful that as a panel, we can explore these questions of the interior life more, in that when Hannah Jones is beginning with the story of her family and talking about the impact of this, of legacies of slavery and what it meant for opportunities for her father and also opportunities for her mother, when they are thinking about the material reality of slavery and what it has meant for the economic and political realities of African Americans, that within the lines and sentences of the spaces of that discourse, what we have an opportunity for is to explore the ways in which this has impacted interior life, and so I'd be interested if we could explore that more, and so then to put it in the context of Du Bois, just as I close here, to turn it to what Du Bois is telling us in The Souls of Black Folk as he is reading through the Sorrow Songs. And just to read it, because it is, I think, quite powerful, and what we have, what I've been trying to offer here. And Du Bois writes, through all the sorrow of the Sorrow Songs, there breathes a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice of things. The minor cadences of despair change often to triumph and calm confidence. Sometimes it is faith in life, sometimes a faith in death, sometimes assurances of boundless justice in some fair world beyond. But whichever it is, the meaning is always clear, that sometime, somewhere, men will judge men by their souls and not by their skins. Is such a hope justified? Do the Sorrow Songs sing true? And I end with that passage from Du Bois to bring us back to this notion of linking the present, linking those realities such as the one which I began in the space of the prison, where African-American life, African-American culture, African-American futures are incarcerated. And that very incarceration is linked to the legacies and roots of the slavery that the 1619 Project brings to fore for us. And further, by culling from the 1619 Project those places where Du Bois, Delaney, and others appear, it gives us that opportunity to then have a deliberation on how the 1619 Project further helps us to think about the critical capacity and ways in which this legacy has affected and impacted the interior life of African Americans. Thank you.
Dr. Hatton, thank you very much. I'm hearing your Kierkegaard roots come through in some of your comments. Thank you very much. Hopefully be able to return. We've heard economic Marxist analysis. Now we're talking about psychology and culture. I'm wondering where Professor McClendon will take us. So, Dr. McClendon, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.